You know, when you hear the name George Orwell, your mind probably jumps straight to 1984 or Animal Farm, right? And for good reason. But the novelist was also an incredibly sharp, witty, and just brutally honest essayist. He wrote about everything, from the horrors of war to the simple joy of a good cup of tea. So today, let's dive into some of his most surprising observations that feel, frankly, just as relevant now as they were then. Orwell had this amazing knack for using a really simple, almost everyday question to make a much bigger point. So let's start with one he posed himself. What really costs more, a reading habit or a smoking habit? And you know what? Orwell, being Orwell, actually sat down and did the math. Back in the 1940s, he figured out his reading habit, and that's including books, newspapers, magazines, the whole shebang, cost him about 25 pounds a year. Meanwhile, his smoking and drinking habits, they set him back almost 60 pounds. Turns out the supposed luxury of books was actually his cheapest pleasure, by a long shot. So, this brings us to his first big idea. He wanted to take on that common complaint you still hear today, that books are just too expensive for the average person, by taking a hard look at his own budget. Think about that for a second. 25 pounds. That was his total bill for an entire year of reading. And this wasn't just a few paperbacks, okay? This covered daily papers, weekly magazines, and all the secondhand books he could get his hands on. His point was simple. Even if you bought every single book brand new, reading was still one of the cheapest forms of entertainment out there. And this chart just lays it all out, doesn't it? As you can see, what he spent on tobacco alone was almost double what he spent on reading. So Orwell basically concluded that if people were being honest with themselves, it wasn't the price tag on books that was stopping them from reading. It was simply that, well, they found a trip to the pub a lot more exciting. But Orwell wasn't just some numbers guy crunching the cost of books. He also spent time working in a secondhand bookshop, which gave him this incredible and often hilarious front row seat to the whole strange culture that surrounds them. He had this, let's say, affectionate term for his customers, pests. You had the elderly ladies who'd come in trying to find a book they sort of remembered from decades ago, and all they knew for sure was that it had a red cover. Then there were the characters who'd order mountains of expensive books, spinning these elaborate tales only to just vanish into thin air without ever paying a penny. But he saved some of his most brutal, most hilariously savage portraits for the professional book reviewer. He paints this picture of a sad, completely defeated figure, forced to just churn out opinions on books he secretly despises, surrounded by unpaid bills and cold tea, inventing praise for what he privately thinks is dreadful rubbish. So, what were people actually reading back then? Forget Dickens or Austen. In the lending library where he worked, the undisputed champion, the queen of the shelves, was Ethel M. Dell, a writer of these really dramatic, pulpy romance novels. Her books flew out the door, while the so-called great classics just sat there collecting dust. It's a perfect snapshot of what people really want versus what critics say they should want. But, okay, Orwell's world wasn't all about quirky bookshops and budget math. He saw something much darker on the horizon, a grave threat looming over the very act of writing and reading, a threat that could turn honesty itself into a crime. For him, the entire fight boiled down to this one core principle: intellectual liberty. And look, this isn't some fancy, abstract academic concept. It's actually super simple. It's the right to report what you've seen and what you've felt. And maybe even more importantly, it's the right not to be forced to lie about your own experiences. He argued that totalitarian regimes make real literature impossible, and here's why. They demand total, unquestioning conformity. The past isn't a fixed thing. It gets rewritten over and over again to suit whatever the party needs today. A writer can't describe what they genuinely feel if those feelings go against the official story. And eventually, the very idea of objective truth just evaporates. And this all leads to his devastating punchline. To write clearly, you have to think fearlessly. And if you're thinking fearlessly, you simply cannot conform to a rigid political doctrine. For Orwell, clear writing and clear thinking were, in themselves, acts of rebellion. Now, it's so important to get this. For Orwell, none of this was just academic theory. These weren't ideas he cooked up in a comfortable study. They were forged in the brutal realities of his own life. He lived it. He'd been a colonial police officer out in Burma, he fought in the Spanish Civil War, and he knew firsthand what real poverty felt like. His understanding of power and how it can dehumanize people came straight from personal experience. I mean, just listen to this absolutely chilling description from his time suffering from pneumonia in a public hospital in Paris. He talks about the horror of being treated not as a person but as a subject, just a specimen for medical students to practice on. He understood in his bones what it meant to be reduced to just a number. But at the same time, and this is what makes Orwell so fascinating, he was not some simple, one-dimensional anti-establishment figure. On the eve of World War II, he had this dream that revealed to him his own deep, undeniable patriotism. He knew, despite all his criticisms of his country, that when it came down to it, he would fight for it. It's that complexity that makes his writing so incredibly powerful. So, where does all this leave us? What does it all add up to? What is the role of a writer, or really any thinking person, in a world that's so full of absurdity, injustice, and constant pressure to just fall in line? For Orwell, the duty was crystal clear. In a world that is drowning in propaganda and organized lies, simply seeing what is right in front of your nose and then having the courage to describe it honestly becomes a revolutionary act. Reading, thinking, and writing weren't hobbies for him. They were a fight. And that leaves us with a question that honestly feels even more urgent today than it did in Orwell's time. He fought against the tyrannies and the lies of his day. In our own age of disinformation, what does it really mean for us to tell the truth?